I'm Esha. I grew up about 10 minutes outside of Geneva. I went to school at Wharton where I was primarily majoring in finance and marketing. So essentially your classic two tracks, you either go into consulting or you go into investment banking. I realized pretty quickly while I was studying that wasn't really the best path for me, and I was really more interested in working on building companies and building brands from the ground up, but then also learning something along the way, which is one of the reasons why construction and real estate became a really interesting sector for me, since I saw that it was not just very dynamic, but also very nuanced. A lot of opportunities that could be explored from multiple different angles, which is why when I started officially professionally working, I decided to start in this industry. Snapbau grew out of my experiences from Abilect, with the main goal being that we look at what is happening in terms of its operational reality on the ground and see what we can do with the tools that we have on a digital level today to kind of take that to the next level and to enable companies to move forward progressively, be able to streamline their operations, be able to reduce their costs, be able to essentially have a more optimal allocation of their resources. Supply chain management was non-existent almost, or very poorly managed in construction. Data management was again very poor or non-existent. Automation, AI basically, was something that people talk about a lot, but didn't really find a good way to start implementing it, while also keeping it very easy for every level of the value chain to use it as well. When we built Snapbau, it was really with that focus of what does each stakeholder on a worksite need, from the person who's passing the orders to the supplier to the people receiving the orders on the worksite. What are the tools that they need today that they don't have? And what can we do in order to build a system that is intuitive at every level of the value chain, to connect multiple levels seamlessly and to apply automation to their daily tasks without necessarily having to invest heavily into building an infrastructure to support it. So we built an operational backbone that is focused on automation, data centralization, analytics to enable these companies to take advantage of it, to progressively streamline their operations and to start having a higher degree of transparency over their costs, which would lead to more control over their costs, better margins overall.
As someone who is not aware of all the ins and outs of supply chain and the different levels of the value chain, could you share an example of what would that look like in the process, or how they would use Snapbau?
Snapbau essentially begins wherever you really need it. So it can start from the very beginning, where you have a work site that you're mandated for, and now you have to start preparing purchase contracts. It may not necessarily be a work site that starts in 2 weeks. It could be a work site that starts in 3 to 4 months. But you do need to prepare the entirety of the process, starting from when you get the mandate to when the first deliveries start going onto the work site. And Snapbau essentially steps in there, where today, for example, customers, they have their mandate, then they start to figure out this is how I need to split up the different requirements that I have at the different sectors. Now I have to figure out which supplier is able to answer which requirement. I have to send it out to the suppliers. I have to follow up with the suppliers to make sure I get the offers in. Once I get the offers in, I have to analyze all the offers that I have, make sure that they fulfill the full requirements that I have, and also try and figure out which offer is the optimal offer for me in terms of price, quality of the service. And all of this today is super manual. So it's all emails, it's WhatsApps, it's on the phone, it's people with 3 big monitors in front of them having 6, 7 PDFs open and then putting it into an Excel manually. The manual charge on this is high, as you can tell, and all of it is not work that cannot be automated with AI. So that's kind of where we come in, where we're just we're going to take all that burden away from you so you can focus on things that are more important, which is optimizing your relationship with your suppliers, ensuring that the rates that you're negotiating are fair in terms of the market as well, and then also making sure that you're able to move as quickly as you can in this procurement process, because the more delayed it gets and the closer you get to the start of the worksite, the more you risk your merchandise getting delivered late, which means that the worksite itself will progress late. It's like a snowball chain of effects that start from there. So it's about reducing the noise, helping them focus on the essential details, and then also accelerating the decision process to when they get to confirming an order, which they do on the system, and then start receiving and validating delivery notes from the supplier as well, before they get to the invoicing aspect of the system, where they're able to automatically validate the invoices as against the delivery notes. They're able to process the information of the payments directly to the supplier to indicate payments have been made, and so on and so forth. So as a buyer, it can literally, like I said, start from the very beginning over there, But it can also be like you have a work site that's ongoing. We have one just 2 minutes outside of our office today where you have a requirement that was maybe not anticipated in advance. And at that point, you're like, well, gosh, I need this right away. Like I need 3,000 square meters of insulation material, for example, and I need someone who can deliver it fast. Like that's my priority. It's fast, fast, fast. You can put it on Snapbau. Your base of suppliers will receive it. And the ones who are able to deliver it from stock directly to you or able to deliver it within a shorter timeline would then be able to respond to confirm that they can deliver, to give obviously the price at which they would be willing to deliver. So like this again, you're not wasting that time in communication and you're just really focusing on what is essential, which is making sure that your worksite is running without issues, without delays, and then ensuring that the supply chain part of the worksite is automated to the maximum degree possible.
Wow, definitely a lot of pain points there and opportunities to remove some of that friction and that manual effort. You mentioned you were in business school and you decided to focus on this space. What helped you realize that this was the path for you, or this was the problem you wanted to solve?
When I was in business school, essentially, it was like very two-track path for the majority of the people that I went to school with. It was investment banking or consulting. I realized pretty early on that I was not a number cruncher. I didn't love the whole spreadsheets game. I didn't love quantitative analysis, I guess. It wasn't something that I was happy doing on a daily basis. I could not picture myself doing it 24/7 either. So I started looking at consulting and thinking like, what could be interesting over there? At Wharton, one of the things that was really great was that you had a two-sided education, so you naturally had your education in classes where it was very core theory, your standard academic rigor, and then you also were educated outside of classes through the clubs that you joined, the people that you knew, the internships that you did, and so on and so forth. I was lucky that I was given the opportunity to be exposed to a lot of different kinds of clubs that were very well structured despite being at a university level, where I had the opportunity to first join a consulting club and then lead it on about a year later after I joined it. And that was where I realized that I did really enjoy what I was doing, where we were able to discuss with companies, learn about different companies, the industries that they're working in, the different fields that they're working in, research those fields, learn about those fields, and then address real problems that these companies had when it came to marketing strategy or product development strategy or customer acquisition and retention strategy. And I realized that kind of approach was what I could see myself doing consistently, and it veered more towards an entrepreneurial fit for me as well, which I always found very interesting. And then eventually I saw an opportunity to develop into a sector that I did find naturally interesting. Like I said, it's very complex, it's very nuanced. Construction and real estate in general has a lot of potential, has a lot of scale as well. So I thought it would be interesting to see how you could tackle a localized problem in one area, build a solution around it, and then see how you could start to grow that solution into adjacent areas and just keep building and building and building the blocks on top of the first keystone, essentially, to see how far you could go. It was like a fun challenge for me as well. And I think that's what like drew me to the industry in the first place. And after that, a first product that was launched on the B2C side that went super well, which led to the development of the second product, Snapbau, as we were discussing on the B2B side. It's been like a really rewarding experience as well, since I haven't been technically trained in the field, but I have learned so much just from the ground up.
What's your methodology, or what worked for you to get up to speed really quickly in an industry where you hadn't had that direct experience in the past?
I mean, I guess like just going back to what would really work well when you're selecting a field or starting off. Yes, you have two things. You can either be directly a domain expert, or you can come with an outsider's perspective. I think the best is when you have a combination of both. So you're not exactly a domain expert, but you know enough about what you're talking about, but then you still come in as a fringe person from the outside. So you do have a different perspective, or like a different angle on the industry itself. The challenge here is to figure out whether or not you're right with the hook or the angle that you're going with. That would lead back to exactly how do you gain the knowledge required to accelerate your product development and adoption into the market. And I think that the key thing over there is relationship building, especially when you're in a field like construction or in real estate. What's super important is to have multiple levels of relationships with different stakeholders across the industry, because each stakeholder will have their perspective on how things work, what is working well, what is not working well, what could work for them, which will be vastly different from what could be working well or not well for somebody else. Especially through my experience that I've had with the first company and then with Snapbau as well, it was very much focused on getting directly to what our target customer could be, having open conversations with them, understanding the industry from their perspective, like just having a sit down and saying, hey, this is what I'm building and how do you think this could work for you? And then having them come back, sometimes saying, no, it actually doesn't work for me at all. Or saying that I think it's an interesting idea, but I definitely think you're missing XYZ elements. And if you make these XYZ elements, I'm a customer right away. These kinds of conversations, you would have to go out and seek them. They do not come naturally to you. But what I've also found, especially in this industry, is that the more willing you are to talk to people, to learn from them as well, the more willing they are to talk back with you. Having that openness, not just of mind, but also like flexibility, is vital, and it enables you to have these very enriching conversations that you could have across multiple levels, across multiple organizations and departments, which help you to narrow down on what is a pain point that is worth addressing. Am I capable of addressing it? So again, when you talk about domain experts, having them, not having them, the resources, am I capable of launching a product that, for example, is supply chain focused, and do I have the resources necessary to scale it and accelerate the adoption as much as possible? All of these kinds of factors that go into deciding how, when, and where to launch a company would be more or less predetermined for you the more conversations you have of this level. With Snapbau, that was where we got really lucky, because since I came with about 3 to 4 years experience already before I started thinking of this idea, I was personally experiencing supply chain problems myself. So I knew that from my perspective, there was definitely things that were super challenging. And then it was just talking to people like, what do you do? How do you handle it? I'm having this challenge. How are you handling this challenge? And a lot of them were like, we don't handle it. We just deal with it. And at that point, you're like, well, if you had a solution that does deal with it for you, would you take it or not? And at that point they were like, if it works, yes, because how much time would I be saving? How much money would I not be losing that I'm losing today if I had something that was taking care of all these little details for me that I don't have time to take care of myself? So it was through starting off with a basic understanding and then moving it forward. And then with Abilect as well, the first company, it was the same thing. It was like, what is a pain point of the private user that I have personally seen, I've personally experienced, that I've personally heard other people express their frustrations on, and like, how do you fix that? But it doesn't stop there. So once you look at it from one perspective, especially in a system like Snapbau or like Abilect, where there are two sides essentially, it's also looking at the other side and saying, where is the value that I can bring to you as well? So like this, you're naturally increasing the potential users of your base, but then you're also making sure that you're building a product, especially in a field like construction, that adds value across multiple points of the value chain instead of at just one point, because that way you are naturally prepping your product to scale. You're creating multiple touch points. So from a user perspective or even from a product perspective, you're just opening doors and possibilities to where you could go. And then the next challenge would be figuring out the right doors to walk through.
So if you had to summarize it into 3 things or rules of make sure you do this, what would that be?
Number 1 would be going back to relationship building that kind of trust level between yourself and then the people that you'll be working with, your customers, your suppliers, and so on. If we take Snapbau as an example, we are a SaaS product. And in my experience, since we also work with SaaS products within Snapbau for our own internal operations, is that you're great until you conclude on a sale, and then you're a ghost. And while I think it works in certain fields that really depend heavily on you being entirely autonomous with the use of the software, in construction, given that SaaS is still growing, that AI is still growing, that there's so much to be developed and to be innovated, and the direction of the development and innovation can really only come from the people who will use the product in the end, it is super important to not just break off the relationship once you conclude the sale, which is why for us we really focus on not just customer acquisition, but more so on customer retention, which goes beyond just your casual once a year, like how's it going, check-ins. We position ourselves as more of a collaborator than a service provider. So it's about when you are a customer or a user or a supplier on Snapbau, you are getting the benefits of the system and you're using it operationally within your enterprise, but at the same time, you are directly connected to someone who's on the team who understands your field, number 1. And then number 2 is always there to listen to you, to get feedback, to see what can we do to make things better. To give a recent example, I was at one of our users' office for like our quarterly check-in about 2 weeks ago, and they were talking to me about how they loved a new feature that we developed, where they can actually automatically track how suppliers are progressing with the offers that they're working on for this customer. The only thing they said was like, yeah, but we don't have a notification of this. And I was like, what do you mean? Because you would have to just go into the system and you check it, and you're on the system anyway. And they were like, but having a snapshot of it could be super interesting. So like this, at the end of the day or the end of the week, like we can already say, I'm okay, I'm good to go. I don't have to follow up with anybody because I know what's going on. And at that point they were like, would an email notification work? And at which point I said, yes, that's actually a great idea. So at the end of the day, you have all the projects that you're working on, all the suppliers who are currently working on the project for you, and you know the status of each of these suppliers. So like this, if you have to readjust tomorrow, or you have to say, oh, you know what, I'm not actually getting the kind of response that I need, so I need to retarget it, or is there something wrong with what I've sent? Do I need to add information? I can correct it right away. And I don't have to wait for a supplier to tell me, yeah, I'm not answering you because you're not doing this, this, and this, and I can't answer you without this information. I already know that there's something to be acted on. This kind of feedback is not something that comes organically, it's something you have to go and look for, and that I think is the number one thing we focus on when we do relationship building, where it's not just a buy-sell transaction that we have, but it's very much a partnership that we establish with each of our customers. So I guess what would be interesting in the next phase of our development is, right now it's working well because we have a very specific target of customers and suppliers that we're working with, so it's very manageable where we are right now. We're over 320 users in, but manageable so far. As we continue to scale, how we would need to scale up our operations and also our systems to make sure that we can support and we can keep up with the same kind of level of commitment and communication with users that we are doing so right now in our early days, which would lead to the second rule, which is having systems that are rigid in that they give a certain backbone to how we're working, but then also super flexible, that it helps us to be as open as we can with each of our users and to be able to get as much information as we can from them, and to be able to redirect also the way in which we approach the industry, that we approach our product as well, to make sure that we are always in line with what the customer wants today, or that we're anticipating what the customer could want in the future. And to be sure that whatever we develop is already answering a need that is already existing or that could come up, so that when we do launch a new feature or a new product or so on, we're automatically feeding it into a customer demand. And then the third would be, well, we can't really escape domain experts. While it's like really good to have a fresh perspective on an industry, you cannot outweigh the fact that knowledge of the industry and of the field is super important. So when we recruit at Snapbau, we only recruit from the construction industry. So it's very atypical, I would say, for a software organization, because we don't have your very typical software sales experts. We exclusively recruit from the construction industry. So we actually have a pool of talented team members, specifically on the business development side, who understand the industry in and out. They know how they think, they know how the people in front of them would be thinking as well. And not only are they vital in the kind of sales dialogue which would enable us to build those kinds of relationships with our buyers and our suppliers, but they're also vital in the development of the product as well. They're able to help us focus on what actually matters and avoid us from adding fluff that maybe might look really good, but is there any practical value that's long lasting that's delivered behind it? That we can't really decide. It's for the customer to tell us whether or not it is practical and long lasting. But with a team that is already focused in that direction, it's much easier to get to that point faster, and it definitely avoids making mistakes along the way. So to tie up the three rules that we follow here is long-term relationship building, having customers that are partners and not just buyers of what we sell. The second would be making sure that we present a backbone structure that can be built on, instead of just keeping things too flexible as well, but still maintaining the flexibility that allows us to have roots and then grow the tree. And then the third being making sure that we're A, coming in with knowledge, and B, also constantly learning from everything around us, so that we can make sure that collectively we are a domain expert that can deliver solutions with a fresh perspective.
You mentioned relationship building and conversations being really key on a repeated basis. Is there a number that you would say, okay, if once I've had 30 conversations or once I've had X confirmations I know I would build, or I know I need to pivot?
The question would be like, how many opinions is enough opinions in order to help us understand if what we're doing is right or wrong, or whether we should be going into a different direction, or whether this is a new product that should be building. It's really difficult to pin it down on a number. A lot of it, again, would have to go on your basic industry knowledge, and then looking back at what certain companies would say to you as well, and seeing if there's a match between what you're saying, because again, every person's perspective is a little bit different, and what everybody wants individually, as long as a majority agree. It's difficult in the construction industry because what I started saying in the beginning was that it's so nuanced, and you have so many different stakeholder groups that each one of them will have their own perspective because they work very differently within the same field. The only thing that kind of remains standard across the industry is the process flow. Across teams, across companies, across structures, like procurement will stay the same, for example. So we look at that procurement process. What we try and look for is that changing in any way? And is that change replicated across different stakeholder groups? And if we see that that change is replicated across different stakeholder groups, at that point we're like, okay, this is where we need to build. So that's where we start from. We look at the process flow, and has the process flow changed? If it's not changed, then we look at ways within that process flow that can basically be optimized across the value chain based on the input that we get from people, being mindful of the fact that since the sector is so complex, and since there's so many different players, and it's so severely fragmented in that way, that listening to too many voices may not really be the best solution. It's about like picking out that aligning thread across all stakeholders to say, yes, that would be a good idea because this actually applies across. So I guess that's why there's not really a limit to conversations that you can have. It's just about continuously having them and being sure that you are constantly receiving this market information, but then also making sure that you have the necessary structure to be able to sift through it and then boil it down to your process flow.
What are a few of those underrated things that actually move the needle when you're building a company?
The biggest underrated thing, which kind of leads off of the most overhyped thing when it comes to building a startup, is the philosophy of high velocity decision making. So it's move fast, break things, and just keep making mistakes and building and making mistakes and building and doing like a classic iteration cycles until you get to something that works. In the beginning, starting days of your product, it could be a strategy in certain industries that could work really well. You have to also be mindful of the fact that your customers don't want to be experimented on. They're waiting for a product that is actually fully functional, that is fully working. And having a product that starts off in a version and then devolves into another one as the company grows and as the user base grows as well is maybe not something that everybody wants to work with, especially in certain fields like construction. Construction loves stability, especially when it comes to systems that they use. So for me, one of the underrated things is actually focusing on building systems and structures, as we're doing here at Snapbau, that support growth, but at the same time provide direction. It creates also like a clear sense of the mission of the company. A lot of people talk about their company mission, but how is your strategy actually aligned to it? That's usually a more difficult conversation to have. And I think that the easiest way to get to a point where you begin to align your day-to-day actions with the company's total mission and vision is by building these kinds of systems and structures that are aligned to enable your team to perform at the level that it needs to perform to best serve your target users. It's not maybe the most glamorous thing that you can do in a company because a lot of it will be quite tedious to put in place, but if you want to build a company from a long-term perspective, it's so important to build that foundation from the very beginning so that as the company grows, it does have roots that it is holding on to, even if those evolve and change over time based on how you develop in the market with your customers. And to build it is not something that can be done overnight. It's not something you can do in a Google Doc. It's something that you do have to spend a couple months with your teams, with your customers, etc., to understand what are the best systems to put in place, what will be the guiding star of the company when it comes to development strategy perspective, and then make sure that you can be, and Jeff Bezos says this really well, you can be very rigid on your mission, but very flexible on how you achieve it. To do that, you do need that system and structure. It's helpful for any founder to have a clarity of mindset as well. It is so helpful for your teams. everybody who's working for you, the minute they have a deeper sense of the identity of the company, where the company is going, it's great to keep trying, to keep iterating. Iterating is super important. Pivoting is super important as well. But it's also even more important to think about, where are we actually iterating from? What is a starting point? And what do we have to keep coming back to? So what, if you're developing a feature, what does that serve in the long run? If we're developing a new customer base, what does that serve in the long run? So I think these kinds of decisions can only really be taken well once you do have that kind of rigid structure that creates a backbone.
So when you say a system, what does that mean for you? Because
in terms of systems, an example of what we have implemented as systems within our organizations, for example, I get that everybody says that they're customer driven, but we more so than anyone else do really have a massive focus on what our customers say and what they need in order to develop from that. One of the first systems we put in place is the entire funnel of getting customers onboarded, accompanying these customers to their first usage of the systems, getting these customers to create a feedback loop for the organization, and then keeping up with them and building that relationship in the long term. So one of the systems that we put in place is more of a process-focused one, where we map out per customer, per supplier, per user, exactly what are the touch points, how exactly do we scale a product with multiple users, but per user, how do we scale our relationship with them as well? How do we make them trust us and to continue to build that trust as well? And that is a process-based work, which is focused on our business development department in terms of how exactly do we get from point A to point B to point C to point D with the customer, and how do we keep that chain going on and on and on.
Coming back to that initial question of what are the things that you as a founder need to do that move the needle, that you believe we don't talk about them often enough, but what you can uniquely do?
As a founder, you have a responsibility in many areas. It's not just working on the first users that you're onboarding, but it's also giving directions to your team and providing that cohesive strategy that the team can follow in order to successfully execute themselves. As a founder, one of the major things that you would be in charge of is basically deciding the direction of the company. The biggest word for direction in kind of the startup field is pivot. I would say that normally when you hear pivot, you think, oh gosh, it's going to be like a massive change, it's going to be a massive turnaround. I would say that your entire business journey is essentially made up of multiple mini pivots. It's a lot about listening to your team, listening to what their experiences are out on the field, because you will reach a point where you will not be on the field as much as they are. It will be also going back to your own experiences based on what you are doing, if you're still working the field as your team members would be as well, and then figuring out, this could be on a daily basis, could be on a weekly basis, how exactly are you making these little pivots in order to essentially come to the final end goal to achieve certain levels for the company. As a founder, building or making sure that your team is comfortable making these mini pivots so that you don't end up doing like a massive radical pivot sometime in the future if it's not necessary, is vital, because it gets them also in the mindset of thinking just because it's not there today doesn't mean it cannot be there tomorrow if it's necessary. And then also, okay, we need to get it there for tomorrow. How do we problem solve this? What is the path of least resistance to get there? What is the easiest solution? What is the most efficient solution to get there? Being able to deliver that kind of environment where you say that it's okay to change direction, it's okay to change strategy, and do these little mini pivots every day is what enables each team member to work at the most optimal level that they can on a daily basis, while respecting that kind of central journey that everybody will take towards the final mission of the company.
You've worked with a number of really large players in traditionally a male-dominated space. What helped you to gain trust and move confidently in those rooms?
That's a question I always get, where everyone asks me as like a girl, how are you managing it in a very male-dominated space? I haven't really felt pushback because of my gender. It's never really been an issue for me in that sense, but I also think it's because the way I approach it is perhaps clinical, where I do see it as like a buy-sell transaction when I first meet someone, where it's just like, well, I have a product, it could potentially work for you, let me just tell you what it does and you tell me whether or not it works for you. So when you approach it like that and you back it with a little bit of industry knowledge and you back it with being able to present yourself as a person who comes from the industry, who is doing something that could potentially be valuable for the industry, it definitely changes the rhythm of the conversation. So automatically you're not talking about, who you are as a person, but you're just talking about what you're there to discuss, which is, I have a product and let's see if there's a way in which you can use the product and I can continue to deliver value to you through this product. And I think by doing so, it nullifies and neutralizes the gender aspect of the situation. It also helps you to walk into rooms with a different perspective. So you're not holding yourself back because like, oh, I'm the only girl in a room full of men. That's not a question, and that's not a consideration. The consideration is that this is a company and I am a company. I have a product, they have a requirement. Let's find a match. We always look for value-driven relationships as well, and we look for ways in which we can continue to show how we provide value to different potential users that we have, bearing in mind that we're not really talking for the person or as a person, but we're talking as a company and to another company. And like this helps people to focus on what is in the end important on both ends, and it helps to progress.
Let's talk a little bit about launching your startup during COVID.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what happened and how you pivoted in that case?
So the first startup that I launched, Abilect, was launched during COVID. The initial business plan that we had basically went out the window at that point because nothing applied. It was such a drastic macro change. It was really difficult to imagine how we could stay on this same path that we had initially structured for ourselves. But I think what was really interesting there was to take a step back, not look at it as a challenge, but see like, what is the new opportunity that's there? We have a product, we have a direct sale, we have a target customer base. What is an opportunity that we can find here in order to grow this product? And that was where we saw opportunities and how consumer behavior patterns changed. And we were like, okay, so there's something that's changing here, like digital is becoming more acceptable. Building relationships over an app is becoming more acceptable as well. So how can we position and structure ourselves to augment that, accelerate that, and still work towards a final vision while taking into account that the pivot that we would need to do in this case would be more of a strategy pivot than a product pivot. That was one of the biggest lessons that one could learn, where you may be presented with a lot of challenges over the course of building a business or launching a startup. And a challenge is only really a challenge if you see it as such. But if you look at it as an opportunity, you reframe the entire concept and you see where are there potential solutions that could benefit your final vision for what you're building. And then when you start moving towards that direction, massive changes like COVID, for example, they just become little bumps along the way, and you're able to very successfully move into a direction that enables you to keep the momentum going and keep going in the direction that you want to go. It does require a certain level of flexibility and agility, but that kind of comes inherently with being a startup anyway.
On a personal level, what gives you that strength or that resilience? What kind of keeps you grounded or gives you strength in those moments?
Little bumps in the road will happen all the time. I think the number one thing is to accept that they do happen all the time, and there's really not much that can be done. From a personal perspective, I've always been someone who I've never liked to continuously talk about a problem. I've always acknowledged and accepted a problem when it exists. You can't escape that reality. You have to be pragmatic about it. But at the same time, just focusing on the problem 100% of the time is not going to get you to the solution. So it's about pivoting your mind and going, okay, yes, this is a situation, this is a reality. Let's make a list of everything that is wrong, essentially, and how can we turn that into something that works in our favor? Like, where is the solution that we can find? That's kind of what drew me to consulting as well, because that's the process that you do, try and figure out what is going wrong, and then you say, okay, well, this is what could potentially make it go right. From a personal perspective, that already that kind of like inclination to work in that way was really helpful. Also, I do find that process quite exciting, where you find the challenge, but then you find the solution behind the challenge, and then you work on the solution, and then you get out of the challenge, and then once you've conquered it, it's so great, and it's like on to the next one and on to the next one, and you grow so much from each of these experiences as well. I recently read something that was so interesting, because they were like, well, if you think you haven't made progress today, think about whether you would want to be yourself 1 year ago. And if the answer is no, then you've made progress. And I think a lot of people tend to overlook that, because you tend to get bogged down if you have multiple bumps that you're dealing with at one time. Just ask yourself that question, like, have I made progress today? And would I be myself 1 week ago? And if the answer is no, actually, I do think I have, because I'm happier with myself today, I'm more proud of myself today than I was a week ago, then you have made that progress. If you use that as a grounding element, where you realize that every little bump is just one step forward for you, nothing is really too hard. That's the thing, you don't really realize when you've been spending so much time just problem solving, that while problem solving, you're actually developing more than you actually consciously realized you were.
What do you think founders aren't talking about enough?
The major thing founders don't really talk about enough is the fact that we do have a tendency to talk a lot about things that go really well, but the reality of the situation is to get to the point where things are going really well, there will be 50% things that do not go well and 50% things that do go well. It's just openly acknowledging that not every plan is going to work, not every product feature is going to work. You may have to outreach the same client 5 times before he says yes, and he will tell you no 5 times as well. All of this kind of process to get to the point where you're just in the end okay, I did it. I have this declared. It's not overnight successes. Everybody talks about how no one is an overnight success, but what people can be more open about or can talk a little bit more about is the fact that to get to being an overnight success, you will have a lot of late night failures essentially, and it's okay. It's completely okay. It's part of life, and it's what I like to call mini pivots as well. It's you have to just keep building on these mini pivots, and you can do as many as you want, and then you get to the point where you are able to declare a win. But that win is not a one-time thing. That's also in terms of founder mentality. Just because something doesn't work today, it doesn't mean that if you change a strategy, it won't work tomorrow. If you do achieve something, it could be a one-off thing, which is great, good for you. First try, you managed. But most of the time it's not, but that's also okay. People should definitely be talking about this more. And I mean, if you do study entrepreneurship in school, that's definitely something that should be discussed more as well. How do you actually strategize through this, and how do you get from point A to point B? But keep that resilience, as you mentioned, through those kinds of trials that you do that don't really work out.
In that spirit, do you have an example of something where you thought, okay, this is gonna work, and in the end it was nope, okay, mini pivot?
I've had so many mini pivots throughout Abilect and Snapbau, it's really difficult to pick one. Snapbau is pretty early days, but we've been progressing so far in the market that one of the early little pivots that we did was when we were building a system that was focused a lot on the procurement side, completely missed out on the logistics side, apart from the basic programming and calendar management of the logistics, at which point I remember I was having a lot of pushback from one customer who was eventually signing with us in 2 weeks' time, so it worked out. But I remember I kept having these conversations and I was kept getting the same feedback from him, and I was like, but we've changed the product so much between the first time I spoke to you, the second time I spoke to you, and I was asking him, what is going on? What is missing still? And that's when he spelled it out for me. He was just like, I keep telling you, but you're not listening to me. It's basically that you don't have this feature. And if you don't have this feature, it's like a key missing for me. So you need to build it. And then I was like, oh my gosh, we do. So then I go to my head of product and I ask him how long will it take to build it? And he was like, but what is it? And then I explained it to him and he was like, oh, so we just have to add a step. So in the end, it was we thought it was going to be a massive pivot. It ended up being a small little thing where we just added a little step into the entire process, which just created an additional process flow element on Snapbau, which gave him the feature that he wanted. And then about 2 weeks ago, I did call him and I was like, I have it now. We have it. We can go ahead. And he was like, let's take a look. Show me how it works. We demoed the whole thing for him and he was like, perfect. I was waiting for this for a year. And I mean, we will be declaring the customer towards the end of June, I think, and it'll seem like it happened right away. But no, it was a year's worth of conversation and a mini pivot that took a little bit longer than I would have liked to happen. But now that it's happening, it's not only worked out for him, but it's worked out for every single customer that we have as well.
What's something that you're currently either unlearning or doing differently in this phase of your founder journey?
It seems like I've already learned it, but one thing I am unlearning is the fact that it's to avoid being too extreme and either structures being too rigid or being too flexible in how you're actually executing, and to find that good balance, which means that sometimes your decision making might be a little bit slower than you would like. That's okay, because instead of having numerous decisions that are taken where you have maybe most of them that are doing well, some of them that are not doing well, it's better to take a little bit of time on certain decisions to make sure that you're actually getting the kind of quality result that you need. And that requires a certain level of rigidity and a certain level of flexibility, so you have to figure out how to balance that. In the past, I was either too rigid or too flexible, and one thing I'm unlearning is to live on those extremes and try and find that balance, and to step back emotionally from the product that I'm building and to look at it clinically and say, okay, so if this is the problem and this is what we need to fix it, like what is the best path forward? What is the best solution forward? How does that fit into our existing structure? And how can we make that flexible enough in order to get a faster timeline on the execution of the result, for example? It's a daily process, but it's in work. What we tend to do here in terms of like what approach is best, like do we need to be more flexible or more rigid, etc. It's like evaluating what is the impact, what is the total impact of the decision, like how many people is going to impact, how much is it going to impact the product, how much is it going to impact the company, how much is it going to impact the user. The lower the impact, the faster we take the decision. The higher the impact, the more we step back and we say, okay, let's think about it. But we also make sure we don't take too long to think about it. So we do set deadlines. So we think within deadlines. So we have the kind of structure and we're like, okay, so in 2 days we need to take a decision, and the 2 days after that we need to execute. But it's really dependent on what is the magnitude of what we're dealing with. And in terms of magnitude, it's like how many people is it going to impact, and how is it going to impact our process, and how will it impact how we execute it as well. And then based on that, we evaluate the risk of the decision making, and then based on that, we decide how to do fast or slow.
All right, last question. What's one bold move you're preparing to make next?
The boldest move that we're preparing on right now is expanding Snapbau outside of Switzerland, which is going to be a whole new ballpark, given that not only are we going to be expanding our user base, but also we'll be entering into markets that may not necessarily follow the same structures or mentalities as a Swiss construction market. So learning that, figuring out how to fit Snapbau into that as well, figuring out how to approach these markets from their perspective as well is going to be the biggest challenge that we will be dealing with moving forward. We're really excited about it. We already have certain support from certain companies outside of Switzerland to take that forward as well. It's just a question of making sure, again, that we have the right process, that we have the right systems, and that we're able to build structures as well in these different geographies that will help us to grow the product, grow the user base, and make sure that we are always aligned, not just with the vision of the company, but also with the requirements of the industry and of our target users.